Time for one of my favorite topics, non-destructive editing. So, what do we mean by non-destructive editing? Well, a brief history. In the beginning, there was the wax cylinder, and if you made a mistake in the recording process, you threw it out and did another take, or you lived with it. Then, we moved on to vinyl, and there were the same problems. Finally, we got tape. You could actually edit things. You could physically take a razor blade to the tape, cut things out, and then tape them together to create a splice. You could do basic vary speeds to change the pitch and the time. And eventually, multi-track tape comes out and you could bounce things down to one channel, record more on the other channels, bounce that down again, keep doing that, and as Queen did, with over 100 takes, create the opera effect in Bohemian Rhapsody. Then, in the mid-'80s, digital comes around, and by the late 80s, everything is on the computer. So, there were some problems with previous technologies in particular. One, it is primarily destructive when you're physically cutting something using a razor blade, like on tape. It's awesome for sound design, and there are some spectacular pieces of musique concrète and early electronic music that are created exactly this way, but it is a royal pain for music. Another big problem. Multi-track sessions could be ruined with a bad splice or bounce, and then you'd have to start over. Another huge problem. Tape drifts out of tune the more you overdub. Listen to Strawberry Fields Forever by the Beatles. It starts at one pitch center, and it gradually drifts down by the end. And I'm not sure if this is a problem, but it forced artists to commit to a take. On the good side, it gets rid of the indecisive and perfectionist search for the perfect take. Performances sounded more human. There was genuine emotion and artistic considerations that were preserved. But on the bad side, there were imperfections that can detract from otherwise awesome performances. So non-destructive editing is what we have because of digital. You're not actually editing the audio file itself. What you're doing instead is creating a set of instructions as to how the audio file, or usually files, will be processed when they're rendered at the end of the session. More importantly, this allows you to go back and undo mistakes. You make a mistake, you don't like it, Command Z. Awesome. You can do more overdubs. You might only be able to record 32 channels at once, but you can have up to 256 channels playing simultaneously. You have way more tracks. You can use overdubs on individual instruments. Typically, your limitations for tracks are only whatever your hardware can physically handle and what the software will handle before it crashes. You can easily copy and duplicate and move audio regions and files in different places and use them in different ways. You like the snare hit here, but you can also copy it and then put it in here. And again, the actual audio files are never touched. If you break something, you can start over from the beginning, re-import the audio files, and you're good to go. And more importantly, it is non-linear. Unlike earlier methods, you can add, subtract, edit anywhere in the file. You don't have to do it in sequence. Basically, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread for audio editing. And even then, I would say it's probably better than sliced bread because you know what? Here's bread, here's a knife. Great, sliced bread. But being able to do that and then put the bread back together, you can't. So, as I've said before, you are responsible for knowing the DAW that you use. You can use either Ableton Live, Logic Pro X, or Reaper. All of them are going to be different for the shortcuts, but there are some basic commands that you will need to know for every DAW. And remember, I have cheat sheets of the most common commands that we'll be using for all of those DAWs available on the course page. But here's what you need to know. Use the keyboard shortcuts. Please, please, please memorize them. It is so much faster than menu diving. And while you're trying to look for how do I do X in program Y and Googling it and searching through menus, if I know the keyboard shortcuts, guess what? I've just completed your mix and stolen your clients. So make sure you learn the shortcuts. Also, almost every DAW will let you remap functions to a MIDI controller, your QWERTY keyboard, or script multiple functions together into one action like Reaper does. This is super powerful. If you have really frequently repeated tasks or functions or groups of functions that you need to run over and over, like if you're working on a mix and you need to normalize everything, pan one half of a stereo file all the way to the left, the other half all the way to the right, separate them into mono files, and then put them on new tracks. Guess what? You can script that in Reaper, and it will automatically fire when you hit that script and tell it to run. You can then map that out to, say, key on your keyboard or on your MIDI controller, and you just have instant push button access to an entire function. Again, you're on your own for specific DAWs, but I can help some of that during office hours. And again, every DAW will have more features than these, but these are the basics. Cut, copy, paste, duplicate. These are almost all going to be exactly like your word processor, including the keyboard shortcuts. Control-C, Control-V, Control-X, that type of thing. Splitting and consolidating regions of audio or MIDI. So this allows you to cut out an extra note, separate a region into multiple slices so that you can rearrange them, or finally slice out and copy individual drum hits or transients. Consolidating lets you take multiple regions and rearrange them into one region and consolidate them, including any silence between the different multiple regions so that you preserve the duration and the spacing. It is extremely important when you are creating stems to export to another engineer to work on for, say, the mix or the master. And it's especially important in mastering in order to preserve the space between tracks before you send it out for duplication. Next thing, reversing audio and MIDI. With this one, it's very easy to do in all of the programs, but be aware that Logic first requires you to render the audio as a new file. I absolutely hate this feature of Logic. This is my single biggest gripe with that program. But it's in the shortcuts. Just take a look at how you have to do it. Fading. So almost every DAW lets you grab the top left corner of a region and drag it in to create a fade in, and the top right corner and drag that in to create the fade out. You can usually hold down a key to change the curve as well. Others have separate fade dialogues that you have to select a region of audio and then bring the fade dialog up, and then you have multiple types of fades that you can apply. Logic has a separate fade tool. It's pretty cool, actually. Crossfading is when you have two overlapping regions and then you select the overlap. Some programs will auto-fade these, like Ableton. Others require dedicated actions like Pro Tools or a tool, which Ableton also has. This lets you fade out one region while you fade in the next for a smoother transition. It's typically going to default to equal gain, but you can also do equal power, and on some you can do individual different curves for the fade out and the fade in to really, really zero in on what is going to sound the best. Mixing using the channel strips. Every DAW has channel strips for each individual track in a mixer view and the ability to group tracks within a channel strip. All are going to have basic functions like volume, pan, and effect sends. Most will have some type of EQ and compression, but it's usually a plugin of some sort. So you'll need to know how to do that. Also, the basic principles of mixing, how to place all instruments within the stereo field using volume and EQ so that they all have their own space and can be heard as distinct musical parts. This is part art, it's part science. We will look at this in class, but I will say this now, and I am deadly serious about this. If you submit mono projects, I will be deducting major points. Use the panning. Stereo, 180 degrees, use the full spread. Pitch and time manipulation will be called different things in different programs. Warp mode, flex time, elastic audio, stretch, doesn't matter. This is a more recent development with digital audio because previously pitch and time were linked, and if you sped up, the pitch would go up, and if you sped down, the pitch would go down. Now it's independent so that you can change the pitch without changing the time and vice versa. So how does it work? Well, the DAW will detect transients and use those to place markers in a region, and then you can add a third transient marker or warp marker or whatever they call it in your particular DAW, that then you can move it to the left and the right, and it will compress audio in the direction you're moving towards and expand the audio in the direction that you're going away from. By dragging that middle marker, you can realign things and correct a slight drift in a track. So for example, if your drummer's really got an awesome take, but there's just one snare hit that's slightly off, you just add a couple of warp markers around it and then adjust it so that it's perfectly in sync with everything else and you have the feel. This can be used cumulatively on larger sections to also warp and glitch the audio in very cool ways, which we'll talk about in class. There are a variety of algorithms for preserving the melodic data, the rhythmic data, or to deliberately warp it. These are really one of the main strengths of Ableton Live in particular. So with pitch manipulation, in some DAWs, you can make very, very slight alterations to the individual notes. It is only very small adjustments, or you're making global adjustments to the region. Some have a pitch quantization effect, like the Max for Live devices in Ableton Suite, pitch correction in Logic, and repitch in Reaper. You can also slice individual segments and adjust the pitch of the region that you've just sliced out. Or you can re-record parts to get a better pitch from the performer. You can also sample the sound, figure out exactly how far off it is, and then adjust that in a sampler. And you can use things like linked pitch time modes in whatever their warping mode is to create glitched, cool sounds and sound design. But if you really want to do this and get really super pitch accurate performances, you may need to actually break down and buy either Auto-Tune or Melodyne. The next one, and this is a big one, is automation. Every DAW allows you to program automation envelopes using breakpoints, and you can usually change the curve from exponential to linear to logarithmic between breakpoints. And these will control how the associated parameter changes over time, how the volume automatically ramps up, how the panning moves from the center over to the left or over to the right, or how you add just a little reverb and decrease the volume to push something back in the mix. Common targets are going to be volume, panning, especially in surround sound and multi-channel and ambisonics, which we'll look at in Music Technology 2. Then things like sends and receives, effects parameters. This is where it gets really fun when we're doing effect manipulation. And also EQ and filters. You might want to have a filter that slowly sweeps to create kind of a really nice woo type effect. Or you might want to add a EQ that is bypassed for most of the track, but then it comes on for just that one little part where it has to add a little bit more sparkle to a solo. Now, automation can also be recorded by setting the automation mode to touch or latch and then read to play it back, and moving the desired parameter while playing, or you can manually pencil it in. This is an essential skill for all types of music tech, for engineering, mixing, mastering, design, composition, etc. All types of technology require automation for music tech. So there's a lot that we've covered in terms of the concepts here, but we're going to focus on this in class, specifically mixing and automation, because those tend to be the hardest to demo on a video. As always, if you have questions on the other topics, have them ready to go, and we will go over them in class as well.